Oh, you'll be re-educated.
Let's make 2020 the start of something special.
If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus.
Parliament is back. Schools are back. And most importantly, after a brief hiatus, Tysky Sour is back. Now, we told you last time, new start time, 7 p.m. That's still happening. There was a slight delay today. That's because we have upgraded the software. So there will be a few teething problems, but you can probably tell, hopefully, if you've got a good quality enough laptop or television, that we're now in HD. So you can find out whether me or Aaron have any blemishes developing before they happen. And making a change from the last 6 months. Speaking to you about the day's politics. How's it going, Aaron?
It's great. The boys are back in town. No, it's great fun. I was just actually commenting before we started. It's brilliant to have something resembling a normal workplace. And it's very, very good to be socially distanced from your mayor, say, Michael. We just want to make that very clear. We're being socially distant.
Yeah, it's important to say because this topic will come up in the show. There is no pressure from Novara Towers for people to return to their workplace. We do not think that bosses and government should be blackmailing people back into work. But we're gonna get onto this in detail later. Basically, I cycle here. There's no danger of contagion going on there. On tonight's show, we have some great stories for you. Obviously, as we've just mentioned, we're going to talk about the return to schools, the return of parliamentary politics. And the blackmail the government is currently directing at workers to go back into their workplaces, regardless of the health risks, both personal and collective. And we're also going to throw in some of the latest developments in the United States, particularly with reference to political violence and whether it is going to be the key that Donald Trump is looking for to get back in the race, to get back the agenda of American politics on his terms so he can challenge Joe Biden to the presidency after his disastrous handling of coronavirus. Stay tuned for all of that and obviously share the show link. We want to get more people watching this live. Probably not everyone knows we've moved to 7 p.m. So, get that word out. But our first story for today, Parliament, schools, Tysky Sour, are not the only things which are back this week. Extinction Rebellion are also back on London and Manchester's street. So the environmental group have begun 10 days of protests. They are pressuring MPs to back the climate and ecology emergency bill. So they're using similar tactics they have been using in previous demonstrations, which is blocking roads and when police come to move them. Resisting arrest, but in a non-violent very non-aggressive way. I think we can get up some images of these protests now, or some videos. Yes, you can see there people who are not resisting arrests per se, but they're actively not following the requests of the police. So the idea here is non-compliance. Yeah, the idea here is to sort of waste police time whilst making it clear that you are peaceful protesters, not aggressive. We can also look at another clip, I think, which is this is a real Extinction Rebellion classic where they've got someone who is, impossible to basically scapegoat or to try and say is an aggressive militant. It's a 92-year-old man who's being arrested because he wants MPs to take climate change seriously. So far, so non-controversial. What has caused a bit of beef, I suppose, on social media today, and it does relate to some serious questions about the politics of Extinction Rebellion, was first of all this banner. So this was jumped on by right-wingers, including Tory MP Matt Vickers. So this is a banner, obviously, Socialism or Extinction, with a hammer and sickle. Apparently this is being held by the Young Communists. And Matt Vickers, who is a Conservative MP, tweeted, "This is what they really want." And it sort of fed the right-wing Twitter sphere, who like to pretend that anyone who says they care about the environment is actually using it as a tool to secretly implement communism. It sort of relates to the cultural Marxism argument, which I know that Aaron was actually doing a video about today. So you can look forward to that coming out on Novara Media. But more controversial on the left than that original banner was the response from the leadership of Extinction Rebellion. So whilst the contents of that banner were getting controversial, or were exciting controversy, Extinction Rebellion put out this particular rebuttal. So they say, "Just to be clear, we are not a socialist movement. We do not trust any single ideology. We trust the people chosen by sortition, like jury service, to find the best future for us all through a citizens' assembly." And a banner saying socialism or extinction does not represent us. I'm going to throw this to you, Aaron. What do you make of this? Extinction Rebellion saying, look, don't buy this line that we are secretly trying to implement socialism, but talking about environmental politics. The people holding up a banner that says socialism or extinction do not represent us. What did you make of all of this?
I think the tweet is really important. It's really illustrative, important point in regards to social movements and how they use digital media, and how actually they're not just using digital media as an instrument, it's actually crafting how these organizations work and where power resides. Clearly, the person who has access to that Twitter account thinks that. To what extent is that democratically decided? Joe Freeman, writing towards the end of the 1960s, talked about the tyranny of structurelessness. So clearly the people that have access to often the media and comms team and these non-hierarchical political movements, often they are the leaders. They're the de facto leaders. They're not voted on, and they have huge accumulations of power. And yeah, I understand the point. That doesn't represent Extinction Rebellion. I get it, but it also doesn't not represent Extinction Rebellion. And actively and publicly saying this isn't what we believe in, dismissing it, minimizing it, in itself is a political declaration. And I think, even people in Extinction Rebellion who might agree with it, who don't view themselves as socialists, but who think they can do something about the climate crisis while not adopting socialist solutions, I would happen to disagree with that, have to understand that, overtly saying we don't agree with this in the present context, it is itself a political statement of fact and orientation.
Well, I mean, I suppose in their defense, they haven't quite said we don't agree with socialism. They just said this ideology doesn't represent us. So there's some ambiguity there. What I think is interesting, though, is how they've defined what counts as ideological. So it's clear. In that tweet, they say, just to be clear, we are not a socialist movement. We do not trust any single ideology. They're trying to put themselves beyond politics to say we're a post-political organization, fundamentally. All we want is democracy and action. And they want to sort of define what that action would be. But let's look at the summary of the bill that they are backing. Now, I say the summary because the bill is about 10 pages long, put together by lots of academics and thinkers on climate change. But this is the summary from the campaign group who've put it together. So it does it justice. And it says, I think we can get this up, in a nutshell, the Climate and Ecology Emergency Bill calls for the UK to make and enact a serious plan This means dealing with our real fair share of emissions so that we don't go over critical global rises in temperature. Our entire carbon footprint be taken into account in the UK and overseas. The protection and conservation of nature here and overseas along supply chains, recognising the damage we cause through the goods we consume. Those in power not to depend on technology to save the day, which is used as an excuse to carry on polluting as usual. And they say ordinary people to have a say on the way forward in a citizens' assembly with bite. Now, I'd say there are sort of two issues here, and I don't, the technology point I do have some disagreements with, but I suppose a more fundamental point is, at least two of those are really ideological. The idea that you were going to come out with the best solution via a citizens' assembly, that's a radical democratic ideology. That's still ideology, just as socialism is. And again, this idea that we're not going to use technology. Why is it ideological to say that what we need is a strong state that's redistributive and has an active role in the economy to bring about a just green transition, but it's not ideological to say that this transition needs to not rely on technology or not have much to do with technology at all, which is what is often sort of put forward by the representatives of Extinction Rebellion. What do you make of that, Aaron?
Well, I think we are absolutely going to need technology because we've probably gone past the point of not needing technology. We're going to need carbon sequestration technologies. We're going to have to withdraw huge amounts of CO2 from our atmosphere, even if we decarbonise by 2050 to avoid warming beyond 2 degrees. Potentially, you might see runaway climate change. What does that mean? It means you have a cascade of feedbacks from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, at which point it becomes, difficult for humans to inhabit planet Earth. So we will need technology. At the same time, it's important to say, well, if there is a technological fix, it allows certain vested interests to carry on business as usual. We can carry on emitting as much CO2 and methane as we like because we have these new technologies. That's an important point. But at the same time, we have to be very clear. In 3 years, China used more concrete than the United States did in the entire 20th century. Humanity has discharged the majority of all CO2 emissions that it's ever done as a species since Taylor Swift was born, right? Things are moving really quickly, so we're going to need technology. And I'll finish with this. Democracy is a means, okay? Even I agree with the whole idea of sortition, for instance. I think a really interesting idea. I'd rather our second chamber, the House of Lords, be elected through sortition than what we presently have. I think it's a really interesting idea. But that's a means, right? So if a citizen or a group of citizens want to go on the streets, freely assemble and say, well, once that process is in motion, we think that these would actually be the political solutions we need. That can't be avoided. What if you get this democratic body of people and they decide that socialism is in fact the right way to proceed? At some point, you're going to need a political response to climate change. And this focus on means not ends, on democracy and not socialism, or whatever you might think is the solution. But that focus on means not ends, it is a way of, it's useful in one way. It keeps the movement very broad, inclusive, permeable, people can join. But at the same time, it means you're not doing anything. And we have to be real here. The Rio Earth Summit is in the early 1990s. Between 1991, I think, and 2013, CO2 emissions carry on massively. I think they increased by about 60%. The biggest single years in terms of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere were in the years immediately following the global financial crisis because China was building so much public infrastructure. And so I think that focus on means not ends, on trying to be inclusive, I think a quite hippie-ish post-political kind of argument. Okay, that may keep you, that may win some friends in the short term. But we've seen over the last 25 years, it's very, very difficult to see how that builds a broader political movement with solutions in dealing with climate change.
Yeah. I think they're all important. And what I would say is actually, I think in some levels, Extinction Rebellion have been very impressive in terms of their pragmatism. And I say this in terms of, their dogmatic sticking to non-violent principles, I think has been one of the reasons why they have grown so much. I think that their theory about social change, has a lot to it. But this idea of distancing themselves from particular policy solutions whilst committing themselves, fundamentally and thoroughly to something like a citizens' assembly, that, to me, a citizens' assembly is going to turn off just as many people as the idea that we need to have a just transition and have an active state bringing about this, a transition to a green economy. So I don't see the pragmatic argument for sticking to a kind of anti-technology, pro-sortition position, but not one which talks about some of the principles of socialism. But anyway, I should clarify that whilst, I do think there are some confusions potentially, or let's not put it like that. Let's just say there's some things I disagree with in the fundamental politics of Extinction Rebellion. I think overall, they have been a good impact on British politics. As I always say, I'm not actually that fussed with the specific things they are asking for, but I think the fact that you have got people coming out into the streets, getting climate change to the top of the political agenda, and demonstrably, polling has shown that since Extinction Rebellion have started, more people have seen climate change as the catastrophic threat that it is. So whilst we might have some disagreements about socialism here or there, all power to Extinction Rebellion. We are going to go straight on to our next story. Before we do that, make sure you share the show link. And I've got one comment. Senator Sam Mezek tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. I have no idea why anyone bothers watching televised political discussion programs anymore when Novara Media and hashtag Tysky Sour is an option instead. Always a great selection of topics and a really good quality commentary from people who actually know what they're on about. That's a very nice testimonial. We should put that on the website. Next story. As we said, Extinction Rebellion's back. Schools are back. We're back. PMQs is back. So Parliament was back from recess yesterday. Today was the first round of Starmer versus Johnson in their weekly battle to win PMQs. Starmer, unsurprisingly, led by challenging Boris Johnson's competence and focusing on the series of U-turns the government have been forced into over the summer period.
Turn after U-turn. It's a fundamental issue of competence. God knows what's going on. There's no grip.
There's too much echo.
His own MPs are right, aren't they?
Mr. Speaker, this is a leader of the opposition who backed remaining in the EU and now is totally silent on the side. Now has performed a U-turn. He backed, and perhaps he still does, Mr. Speaker. This is a leader of the opposition who supported an IRA condoning politician who wanted to get out of NATO and now says absolutely nothing. This is a leader of the opposition who sat on the front bench whilst there was anti-Semitism.
I think there are questions being asked. We do need to try and answer the questions that's being put to the Prime Minister. It will be helpful to those who are watching to know the answers, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it will be helpful to all those who are watching to know.
Minister, I think I'll make the decisions today. Come on, Prime Minister.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, if I may say, I think it will be helpful to all those who are watching to know that this opposition and this leader of the opposition said absolutely nothing to oppose the method of examinations that was proposed, and indeed they opposed the teacher accreditation system that we eventually came up with. Is he now saying that those grades aren't right, or is it just Captain Hindsight leaping on a bandwagon and opposing a policy that he supported 2 weeks ago?
Yes, Starmer.
The problem is he's governing in hindsight. That's why he's making so many mistakes.
So we're having a few teething issues. So I'm not 100% sure when you started watching that clip or at what point it cut in. But basically what was going on is Keir Starmer saying, you're completely incompetent. You've done all of these U-turns. Can you explain why even your backbench MPs are saying that this government looks like a bit of a shit show? And Boris Johnson completely avoids answering the question, and he comes back and says, you backed Remain, and then says a bunch of stuff about Jeremy Corbyn. It all comes across to me as a little bit desperate. I presume they've done some focus groups, and they think that in some parts of the population, just banging on about those features of Keir Starmer, which they see as a weakness, potentially in the Red Wall, where Corbyn and the Remain campaign were not very popular. Maybe there's a big picture here, and they think that whilst it looks pathetic when you're watching it live, it can sort of hammer home a message that could be effective in damaging Keir Starmer. But, I mean, to me, it looks a bit pathetic. It looks like Keir Starmer is actually on the attack, finally, and that it's going quite well. Aaron, what do you make of it?
Yeah, look desperate, and it's hard to believe there isn't a bit of a plan or intentional design behind it, because it was like he was drunk. He said Remain, Corbyn, IRA, and you wonder, on the one hand, do the Tories have a plan? If Keir Starmer and the Labour, I don't think they will, by the way, but if they started polling 5-10 points ahead, what's the plan? Is it about fighting the last general election? Because that's what they basically are looking at. They're saying, we can paint Keir Starmer as Jeremy Corbyn Mark II. And Keir Starmer, for whatever other weaknesses he may have, very clearly said in his pitch for the leadership, they will be able to do that with me the least easily. Of course, anybody who's been in a shadow cabinet, served under their predecessor, that's going to happen. But he said, I will be something of a break in that respect. And so they may need to find a new line of attack. You know, I do think that opinion poll that came out last Sunday, I personally think the opinion polls are quite suspect. So far, they've been an outlier in terms of how successful Labour are doing. Labour are obviously doing well because they're closing the gap. The question then is, well, there's a broader context of 50,000 plus deaths, economic downturn, you know, Tory U-turn after U-turn, and yet Labour at best in one poll are level pegging. However, you know, if that changes, or if that continues, let's say, if a gap opens up of 5-10 points, I'm very, very curious as to what the Tory strategy would be. They can't keep on fighting the last general election because, generally speaking, that's a recipe for defeat.
I think that's a really important point. And I suppose this comes down to actually two attacks which the Conservatives have tried, which, and again, maybe we're wrong, maybe focus groups are saying something completely different, but which look a bit pathetic and look like they're not landing, is to attack Keir Starmer as he was before the general election, which was one of the key drivers for a second referendum policy within the Labour Party. I mean, some people might be kind of annoyed that now he's distancing himself so far from a policy which he was so instrumental in getting to, or in getting onto the Labour manifesto. But there we are. It does seem like they're struggling to tar him with that brush now that politics has moved on, and they're also struggling to tar him with the brush of Jeremy Corbyn. However unjust it is, obviously a lot of mud stuck to that leader. Where they could, be finding a way in, and where I think the Labour leader needs to be careful, is on this idea, or this Captain Hindsight idea, which is that, look, you say that we've made these mistakes, but you didn't come up with an alternative policy at the time. And we've talked many times on this show how the Labour Party, one of their weaknesses at the moment is their refusal to take positions on anything. They often come out with positions and policy positions almost sort of 24 hours before the government announces them. So it seems like they will only back something when it's absolutely right at that moment about to become policy. So you could make a valid critique of them, which I think the Conservatives will increasingly do, which is that they just complain. They complain when things go wrong, but they don't actually offer alternative solutions beforehand. They will be able to say something slightly different when it comes to the furlough because they have been talking for quite a while about how that should be staggered, but we'll leave that broader issue for a future show. We're going to go on to our next story. Make sure you like the feed. And as ever, you know that, Novara Media, that Tysky Sour is only possible because of your kind support. We have updated the software. We're going to keep upgrading the quality of this show, how it looks to you. Apologies again if there's a few teething problems today, but we promise it's all going to be worth it in the end. So do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. After almost 6 months of the majority of Britain's young people remaining out of schools, this week they have finally returned. That's a good thing. And we should still be backing wholeheartedly the union's campaign to make sure that that goes as safely as possible, that the resources are provided to teachers and schools so that we don't see another coronavirus spike because kids have gone back. But ultimately, 6 months out of mainstream education for most kids was not a good thing. It was regrettable. But it seems like at this point in time, the unions and the government both seem to be somewhat agreed that they have to go back now. So the framing of the debate is now, how safe is it going to be when they're back? And that is really what we should all be discussing. What the political class should be debating on television and on the front pages of the newspapers are, how are we going to make sure that this incredibly necessary thing, which is that kids go back to receive the education that they need, goes by without creating an appalling second spike. But that is not how they are greeting this moment. That is not their focus as kids go back into their classrooms. No, instead what they are using is this opportunity as one to blackmail workers back into their offices. So we're going to go to a Daily Mail front page from this morning. So they write, they're back at work. Where is the rest of the UK? So they're saying, if the kids have gone back, then why haven't the adults gone back? If the kids are brave enough to go back to school, why can't the adults suck it up and go into their offices? And the reason this is a terrible argument is one, why would you force anyone to go back into their offices if they don't need to, if it's an unnecessary risk? But also, they've completely misunderstood the relationship between kids going back to school and workers going back into their offices, because quite in contrast, in direct contradiction to the idea that because kids have gone back, workers should go back. In fact, no, it's because kids have gone back, workers should not go back. Because as we've been told over the last 6 months, completely correctly, this idea of the reproduction rate of coronavirus, the R rate, that goes above 1 if we do too many things at the same time. So if we want to make sure that our kids, as is necessary, can go back to school without causing a second spike, what we have to do is make sure that all the unnecessary things we stop doing. So what we should be saying is, so that our kids can safely go back to school and so they can safely stay in school, if you can continue working from home, do it. But that's not what they're saying. And they're not saying that purely because they want to back up the interests of commercial landlords and, in some cases, their own business models. So I want to go to another headline now, which is from the Evening Standard. So this is edited by former Chancellor George Osborne, owned by Russian billionaire and now Lord Evgeny Lebedev. And they went with a very similar headline to the Mail. But they also had this comment. So they say, today a new London on the front page should begin. Today a new London should begin. Careful to contain COVID, but ready to return. It's up to each one of us. The magic which makes London is in terrible danger. A ghost city is no city at all. Now you read that and say, oh, this is about the general good of London. What we want is people to go back to work so that the remarkable energy that makes London great can be brought about, can be made live again. Now, that's bullshit, because if people wanted London to go back to the way that it was before, they would be going back to work right now. But what you have realized now is that, one, people value their health more than going into their offices and making sure that Pret can continue operating at a profit, and that potentially people getting up at 6 a.m., getting on a packed tube, going to work, spending a bunch of their wages on lunch was not quite as magical as George Osborne and Evgeny Lebedev might have believed. But why would they want you to go straight back? Because in the economy where people, have a work-life balance, maybe they work for 3 days at home, 2 days in the office, what aren't they reading so often? The Evening Standard. Whose advertising revenue falls? Lebedev's, the Russian billionaire who's now a lord. So we have our media class who are supposed to be informing us about how this country can best contend with coronavirus, who instead are putting their petty interests of short-term profit ahead of the public good and calling it news. You couldn't make it up. This is, I suppose, the more obvious sort of argument put forward, which is, ridiculous. The more subtle argument as to why people need to go back into their workplaces, other than to relight the magic of London, is to save jobs. This was an argument made by ex-Tory Health Minister Jeremy Hunt this morning on the Kay Burley Show. Let's take a look.
Do you think that the government did too good a job when it comes to lockdown, in that people thought, if I stay at home, I'll live, if I go out, I'll die, and now they don't want to send their kids back to school?
Well, I think what we have in this country is a very sophisticated, educated electorate who understand health issues very well. And when the instructions were clear, and they were very, very clear about staying at home, people complied. But we're also very inventive and creative. And I think a lot of people found that it was much easier to work from home than they perhaps thought it would be. And so that's why it's proving a bit more of a struggle to get people to go back to work, because people obviously find it's a lot more productive if they're not having to commute. But as Therese Coffey was saying earlier on your show, the big problem is all those jobs in city centres that depend on people going back to work. I think there's also someone who ran their own business for many years. There's a creativity you get, a buzz in an office, which you don't get when you're doing meetings over Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And there's only so long that you can carry on working completely remotely before you start losing the kind of fizz and excitement that you get in a really good workplace. So I think people will want to go back to work eventually. I hope it happens soon.
So obviously the headline line from that interview was Jeremy Hunt saying that people want to go back into the office for the excitement and fizzle. And the obvious response being, has there ever been anyone who looks like they suck more excitement and fizzle out of a room than Jeremy Hunt? Someone who looks permanently constipated and struggles to smile. We can also, we don't actually have to speculate as well, because It just so happens that before Jeremy Hunt was an MP, he was co-founder and co-director of the company Hot Course. And one of his employees there was Luke Turner, now an editor at the music magazine The Quietus. Turner worked as an admin at the organisation and had this to say about the firm. What made it the worst 3 years of my life was the working environment and the expectation put onto the staff by Hunt and other managers. When a deadline approached, we were expected to work late into the night for no overtime or recompense. Rarely we were thanked for our labours. There was a general air that we should be grateful for the remarkable opportunity that this endless admin offered. There was certainly a different attitude towards employees who'd been to private school or Oxbridge than to the rest of us. In such a high-pressure environment, yet producing such mundane work, stress levels rose. I know of good friends and colleagues who suffered near nervous breakdowns from the experience of working in such a vampiric, morale and confidence-sapping operation. Everything was secondary to the operation of the business. So that was written back in 2012 about working in an office under the management of Jeremy Hunt. He's now on the television saying people should go back to work because of the excitement and the fizz.
I mean, have you ever been to a place which has got less excitement and fizz than the average open plan office? Right? Actually, there's a wealth of literature about this where if we were to actively design places where people were constantly distracted, unable to be productive, unable to concentrate, unable to do what Cal Newport, an academic who specializes on precisely this topic, calls deep work, we would have the open plan office. And what this is all about, and this is really important, again, this is not about capitalism wants us to go back to the office. Many firms would actually love to get rid of their office full-time. I'm hearing this repeatedly, actually, from friends who work in businesses, and they're saying remote working works great. We're not going to renew the lease. That's happening a lot. And to keep them competitive, to save money, they're very happy to outsource office costs to their staff, right? That's not a progressive thing, by the way, but they're happy to do it. This is not about maximizing the interests of business even. This is about maximizing the interests of rentiers, people who own the office blocks, the landlords. And this is an important fracture within British capitalism about where is value being not created, captured. And it's not by enterprises that are creating sort of new goods and services. Overwhelmingly, it's by the rentier class, by the landlord class. Really important point. So this idea of us all going back to work, yes, okay, it would get Pret off life support, but the people it would serve the most are the landlord class.
We're gonna reveal something about Jeremy Hunt's relationship to the landlord class in one moment. First of all, I want to go back to that jobs point because it is going to be the politically most relevant argument which is made, which is to, I suppose, essentially guilt people, blackmail people, say you have to go back to work, otherwise these people, potentially on lower incomes than yourselves, will lose their jobs. The obvious sort of example here, what's going to become, I suppose, the archetype of the job that will be lost if people do not go back to their offices in the same numbers as before, is the person working at Pret. But then we have to ask, are those jobs really worth saving? And that does not mean should the people who are in those jobs, if they lose their jobs, they obviously have to be fundamentally supported. We need retraining system. We need a green industrial revolution. That means that jobs come about that people actually want to do and which actually add value. But do we want to encourage the public to risk their health, to risk the R rate rising above 1 and schools having to close just to save the Pret economy? Now, there was a great article in the FT by Sarah O'Connor. This is not a socialist publication, who was saying, no, we don't want to save the Pret economy. So the article's headlined, "Goodbye to the Pret economy and good luck to whatever replaces it. Cities will not die. Their benefits could become more diffuse with well-paid workers spreading into the rest of the country." I recommend reading it. Great piece. But it had this part about people working at Pret that I thought was particularly useful. So she writes, high housing costs were particularly problematic for the low-paid workers who made the cities run. Increasingly, only migrants seemed willing to accept low-wage jobs cleaning offices or making coffee. In 2017, Pret's Director of Human Resources told Parliament that just 1 in 50 of its job applicants was British. Later that year, the Financial Times interviewed a Pret worker from Romania who woke at 3 a.m. to commute an hour and a half from East Ham to the branch in Waterloo. She was paid £16,000 a year. Now, obviously, there were some people that will use that argument that 1 in 50 people who are applying for it are British in a sort of xenophobic way. That's why we need Brexit, so that we have British people serving British sandwiches. But obviously, the implication there is not that too many foreign people are applying for jobs at Pret. It's that the conditions are so low that people, with higher expectations about what they should be earning because they were brought up in this country, won't work there because they're not willing to get up at 3 a.m. in the morning, commute 2 hours to work for 16 grand a year, and probably pay about half of that to, again, a rentier. So this is not the best we can do. When someone says the alternative to us going back to the status quo as it was before is mass unemployment, call their bluff. The alternative to us going back to how things were before is we have a government that takes the responsibility to bring about an economy that actually works for ordinary people, not pays them shit wages to have fundamentally a miserable life doing things that they don't particularly value, and ultimately paying half of it to rentier. Aaron, how do we win this argument that we don't want to go back to the economy as usual? We want jobs, but we want them to be better than they were before.
Yeah, it's an important question. I think one of the incredibly predictable responses you get from this is, well, actually, rentiers are really important because pension funds are tied into the rent economy, and if we get defaults from commercial rents, then that little old lady, her private pension, it won't be paid, right? This isn't true. Pensions, okay, are indexed. They invest in a bunch of companies. They spread the risk, okay? So for every commercial property company that's going to collapse, and yes, the returns won't come from that, there are also investments in Zoom or hand soap dispensers, right? So firstly, that argument isn't remotely correct. Secondly, we need to have a conversation about a 4-day working week, I think. This is the best way right now to manage everything in the medium term. You don't even need to necessarily, it's a long-term measure. You say we're going to move to a 4-day week. We're going to have the state top up people's wages, carry on furlough effectively, I think, for significant parts of the economy, and perhaps muck about with, tax brackets, tax bands, and so on. Have something resembling a UBI, not a UBI, something resembling a UBI. A really good threshold for people basically to have. So you can make ends meet on about 3 days work a week, which presently for much of the country, particularly London, isn't true. Secondly, this is going to have a really big impact on London, huge impact on London. We don't really know how much. Right now, property prices are still high. Rents are actually falling. Hackney's rents are falling because Airbnb, the Airbnb economy, just like Pret, it's really suffering. There's a huge increase of supply for properties. All these flats that were going to be rented on Airbnb for 2 days, 3 days, 1 week, 2 weeks. All of a sudden, they're saying, well, look, actually, let's just get a secure tenant in there for 6 months, much more secure. We'll get our money. So that means that rents are falling. Now, the question for a young person is this, and I don't know the answer. If you were 18 or 19, Michael, would you start university this year? I wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't move to a city to then do my lectures online. If you were a recent graduate, would you live in a large city like London and try and make that break? I don't think I would. And so I think, the longer this crisis goes on, I think we're going to have a really big break with the kind of status quo common sense that we've had for the last 20, 30 years, which is if you want to get ahead, you have to go to major metropolitan areas, particularly London. Now, right now, there's no alternative, right? If you're a young person, you want to get ahead, well, okay, what else do you do? That's a $64 million question, but it's not going to be the previous kind of status quo ante, which is go to London, get an internship, get your foot on the ladder. Nobody's going to be saying that for potentially 2-3 years. That's a huge rupture for a generation of young people entering the labour market.
And ultimately, what this is about is giving people more options. Because obviously, I want anyone who wants to move to London and go to universities to be able to do that. But the idea you should have to move to a megacity to get up in the career ladder and in the process spend half of your income on rent is ridiculous. I want to take us back to Hunt briefly because, as we've mentioned, one of the main people who are going to lose out if people don't go back to their office spaces in the same numbers as they had before is commercial landlords. Because what many businesses are realizing, as Aaron has mentioned, is that they can save money on rent by getting people to work from home either the whole time or half of the time. I mean, I'm personally in favor of sort of two days in the office, 3 days at home. So you sort of get some of that socializing without all of the commuting and all of the pressure. But someone who will lose out because of this is Jeremy Hunt. because yes, he is, something he did not mention in that Sky interview, a commercial landlord. I saw this mentioned on Twitter today. I had to fact check it, so I went to the Register of Interests. You can see the incomes of all parliamentarians. And this was on Jeremy Hunt's. So land and property portfolio value over 100,000 and or giving rental income of over £10,000 a year. So on there, he's got half a share of a holiday home in Italy. He's also got 7 apartments in Southampton. But in the middle there, half share of an office building in London. So this man is a commercial landlord. And you might say, half share of an office, is that big a deal? Now, let's look at what this office is and also how it came about, because it tells you something about the man, Jeremy Hunt. Again, so the office it's a big office in Hammersmith. It was, and potentially still is, I'm not sure, occupied by Hot Courses. That's the company that Jeremy Hunt created. He was co-director, co-founder of that. Now, the way that this building came to be in the ownership of Jeremy Hunt and his co-director was that it was paid to them in dividends. So the company, instead of paying out money in cash in dividends to its co-founders, paid out this property. And then what happened after that is that Hunt rents back the property to Hot Courses, his company at the time. And they did this, according to the Telegraph, to avoid tax. So this scheme, the kind of thing that ordinary people don't do, you don't transfer someone a building to then rent it back yourself. This is the kind of thing that only the 1% do. It saved Hunt and his colleague £100,000 each, according to the Telegraph. But that is not enough to keep the man happy. He seemingly wants people to risk their lives, their health, so that he can keep making money on his Hammersmith office block. Any comments on this before we go to our next story, Aaron?
Well, there's a good bit of reportage to be done about Jeremy Hunt's family, who are very much ensconced within private healthcare. He is related to a former Secretary of State for Health, Virginia Bottomley, who went on to become a private healthcare lobbyist. His father is a private healthcare lobbyist. A very interesting family, and tell you a lot about the parasitic nature of the British elite within contemporary capitalism. The fact is, a commercial property landlord isn't surprising. It's the logical conclusion of everything else you'll ever hear about the man.
Agree. You did a great video on that a while ago, didn't you?
Years ago now.
Jeremy Hunt and Virginia Bottomley. We're going to go on to our next story. First of all, make sure you subscribe to this channel. I had said we want to get our subscribers up to 100k by the end of the summer, but I'm now including September in summer because the weather is slightly better than it used to be, climate change or whatever. Obviously, we shouldn't celebrate the hotter temperatures, but it does have some side benefits, which is that we get warmer weather and we have a longer time to acquire the 100k subscribers, which I so dearly covet. Also, make sure you turn on notifications so you know every time we go live. We're going to go to our next story, and this was a particularly tragic story that hit the headlines over the last 2 weeks while we were away. It was about the death of Mercy Baguma. Mercy Baguma was an asylum seeker originally from Uganda living in Glasgow. She was found dead next to her malnourished 1-year-old child. She was actually found because of the crying of that child. Really, really horrific story. Baguma had recently lost her job after her right to work had been withdrawn by the Home Office. And things we know about her, she had contacted the charity Positive Action weeks before her death, stating she didn't have enough money to look after herself or her child. It's a completely tragic story, horrific story, and it should lead anyone with a modicum of compassion to question the rationality, the legitimacy of our hostile environment policy, which intentionally makes the lives of vulnerable people miserable, difficult, miserable, so that the idea is that then they won't come here. It's a completely defunct theory and a callous, cruel way of running a country. But I said there it would cause anyone with a modicum of compassion to question that policy. Now, someone who was asked this morning whether she had any compassion for the person who died in this tragic situation was Therese Coffey. She's the Minister for Department of Work and Pensions and was speaking to Kay Burley on Sky this morning.
I just wanted you to talk to me briefly about Mercy Baguma. And for our viewers, Mercy was a woman who died of starvation in Scotland. Her little baby was found crying next to her. You were asked about it at the time and you didn't want to talk about it. She was an asylum seeker. Having reflected on it, what would you want to say about it?
OK, I haven't actually been asked about this lady before, so I don't know where that's come from. But
But you know who I'm talking about.
I think I know the situation, and it's a lady with immigration status that may have changed. This really is a matter for the Home Office to decide what the immigration status is for each individual. I'm conscious that people can also apply for changes to the Home Office if they are struggling with aspects of that, and the Home Office can make that change so they can get access to public funds. I'm afraid I don't know the individual details of this lady.
I understand that, but as I said, I know you as a compassionate woman. This woman starved to death with her baby next to her.
Well, I don't know the exact ins and outs. I know it happened in Glasgow fairly recently, but really the Home Office is the person who decides on whether or not
as a human
we
being,
can do that.
What sort of society are we when a woman starves to death?
What I'm trying to say, Kay, is that when people are in very difficult situations like that and they're looking for help from the government, there are ways they can access that help, but I don't know the individual case.
But I'm asking you, I'm giving you the opportunity to be compassionate about, you know
I've just said people can.
You know enough to know that this woman died and her starving baby was found next to her.
And as I've said, Kay, when people are in very difficult situations, there are ways that the government can help, but it may need an application from them to say, I need some help in this way. So I don't know the exact in there, but the government has been helping millions of people across the country. People without recourse to public funds can apply to the government to get a change in their status so they can get support, but that takes them through a Home Office route, and then organisations like DWP can help.
So all Therese Coffey had to do there was to say to Kay Burley, yes, of course, this is a tragedy. Of course, I feel sympathy for this woman who was clearly in an incredibly difficult situation. And of course, I feel sympathy for that child. I mean, how tragic for a malnourished 1-year-old to have their mother die next to them. And Therese Coffey can only look at this through the cold-hearted language of a bureaucrat. She never expresses any sympathy, any regret for what's happened. She's just said, well, this is a decision for the Home Office, not a decision for me. And potentially if this person was having problems, they should have gone to the Home Office. Maybe they didn't. Ultimately blaming the person who's died in this situation. And this just makes me think two things, right? Either Therese Coffey's a psychopath. You know, she's someone who cannot feel any sympathy towards people in desperate situations. And that's why she joined the Conservative Party. You know, maybe that's what motivates her in politics, right? It's possible. What probably, though, I think is more likely is that having to go out on television and to defend Tory party policy day after day after day throughout her entire career is that it has made her kind of functionally into a psychopath. You're asked, can you feel any compassion, any regret for this person who's been through an absolutely tragic experience? She doesn't have to stand up there and say, obviously, this proves the hostile environment is wrong. Obviously, I think it's evidence that the hostile environment is wrong, but she didn't have to go out there and say that. She could have said, obviously, this is an incredibly tragic situation, but we have to look at, you know, the unintended consequences of policy or whatever. She could have given a technocratic answer which recognized the humanity of this person. And she couldn't. She structurally couldn't. Asked 4 or 5 times just to say, can you show any compassion about this? No. And either this is the kind of person who goes into the Conservative Party, or this is the kind of person which the Conservative Party creates out of people. Aaron, I don't know if, you know, which one of those you think it is, but this idea, you know, this cold-hearted logic of the bureaucrat in a way who can't see people as people, but only as, you know, potential clients or people who should have made a complaint or people who didn't have a right to this benefit or that benefit. You know, how does this come to be?
I think she's leaning into it. I mean, you're saying, you know, maybe she genuinely has an inability to feel empathy or sympathy with fellow human beings. I mean, that's plausible, but it does feel like she's intentionally leaning into it. And is that performative? Is that a way of like just dismissing the emotive aspects of politics, which some people on the right like to do? Is it habit? She's been around people so frequently. She rehearses the same performativity so often, particularly on people on the sharp end of welfare reform. Is that what it is? I really don't know. I think it probably is. I think it's probably a bit of both, right? I think it's habit, and I think she's leaning into it. I think a lot of people now, especially since Trump, because Trump is a very successful politician, right? Trump has been a president now for 4 years, and his whole thing is, I don't really give a toss what, you know, moralizing voices are going to say about the most vulnerable people in society. And he won the presidential race in 2016. Look, if he wins again, in a way it's worse because it gives people like Theresa Coffey, it gives them permission to be like this. And on the one hand, clearly they have no moral qualms with it. More importantly, for elected politicians, they don't have any political qualms with it because they think it's not really going to have a political overhead. And look, the Tories right now have an 80 majority. We can talk about all the reasons why. It's not because they're nasty bastards, right? That's part of it. But I do think where America leads, Britain generally follows. We have in the Anglophone world, they set the agenda, whether it's the Conservative Party, whether it's the Labour Party, generally speaking. And I do think this kind of harsh coarsening, almost indifference to human life, is quite new. I think that David Cameron or Jeremy Hunt wouldn't do that. And what I think is really concerning is that what you see there with Theresa Coffey is it's the future of the Conservative Party. The newer intakes, the post-2010 intake, particularly from the last round in December last year, I think you're going to see a lot of that.
I suppose it's just occurred to me, actually, there's potentially a darker explanation of what's going on, which isn't that she's unable to show compassion or that it's a habit or whatever, but that it's a strategy. So if she refuses to show compassion, what is she doing? Well, she's provoking disgust among some viewers, but among other viewers, she's normalizing not feeling compassion for people who don't necessarily have right to remain in this country. So she's saying, she's giving you permission to say, do not look at this person as a human. Look at this person as a client. Look at this person as someone who has applied for papers and didn't get them. Look at this person who didn't make a request at the right time. And, you could argue that's a strategy which is perfectly rational for the Conservatives to adopt if they want the policies which they have been implementing, which cause so much harm, to be electorally sustainable. You have to make people, structurally, you have to make people not feel any sympathy towards the people who you are screwing over. And tragically, it's been quite successful. We're going to go on to our next story in one moment. Aaron mentioned there that in the Anglophone world where America leads, Britain follows. We have another example where that seems to be the case. And before we go on to that, subscribe to the channel and do go to novaramedia.com/support. Donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can keep building this organization. We can keep going, upgrading our technology and giving you free shows on Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. Every week. Okay. And more besides.
Our video offer is more than just Tysky Sour. Although Tysky Sour is, the centerpiece. Michael Walker is the anchor, which, gives Novara a political weight in the seas of 21st century politics.
Yeah, I'll go with that. You started it though, babe. No credit where it's due.
But now you're going to... Is that how it works?
I'm kidding. No, I'm not saying that.
No, Tysky Sour is fantastic.
I was jealous of you on my... Because I've just, as many of our audience might know, I took a week's holiday, which is why we haven't had any Tysky over the last week. I was getting to know my gorgeous new niece, 9-month-old. So I learned quite a lot actually about babies. I didn't really know, they're very interesting beings, I suppose. But I was a bit jealous of you, Aaron, because I read books. Because I host Tysky Sour, I'm constantly looking at the news cycle. I don't really get to, do the big ideas, which is what you do on the Bastani Factor.
Thank you very much.
I read books from start to finish. And I was like, this is amazing. Because normally I only read books via listening to hour-long interviews with Aaron Bastani of excellent authors. The book I actually read, or one of them, was Vincent Bevan's. What's it called? The Jakarta Method.
Excellent book.
And it's an excellent book. And you also have to watch Aaron Bastani's interview with Vincent Bevans. It is very, very good. And completely, if it doesn't align with your worldview already, it will change it. It will transform it. Brilliant book, brilliant interview. We're going to go on to our next story. This week is ex-Tory candidate Tim Davies first as Director General of the BBC. So he has initially set his sights on banishing supposedly left-wing comedians from the platform. We're going to talk about that more in one moment. But first of all, it looks like there could be a more challenging problem arriving in his in-tray. That's because, as the Mail reported on Sunday, there are not one but two new channels which are planned to be competing with the BBC from its right. So to say the BBC is too liberal, too left-wing, we are going to take them on from the right. We'll explain what those two channels are. So the first, as reported in the Daily Mail, will be the new 24-hour news station called GB News, Great Britain News, presumably. You see the headline there. The project is being led by the former director of political programming at the BBC, Robbie Gibb. Gibb left that job to become head of communications for Theresa May. So for obvious reasons, he spent the last 2 years seeking a new job, and it seems like he has found one. Let's go to some of the copy. The 24-hour station, due to launch early next year, aims to capitalise on growing discontent over the BBC, with sources describing it as an antidote to the woke wet corporation. It's going to be available on Freeview. It's already received a licence. Now, you're going to think, who funds this kind of thing? Have they managed to assemble a genuine popular movement who are desperate to have a channel and a platform which isn't a woke, wet BBC lookalike? No. This is not a grassroots funded organisation. This is a billionaire funded organisation. So it's going to be run by All Perspectives, which is linked to US billionaire John Malone. He's chairman of Liberty Global, which owns Virgin Media. So we're going to have one more platform owned by, in this case, an American billionaire deciding what can and cannot be shown on political programming, and fundamentally shaping debate in Britain in a very unaccountable way, and ultimately most likely for the worst. Obviously, this is following in the model of Rupert Murdoch, the Australian billionaire who's had an absolutely toxic impact on British politics by using his money to have access to politicians and to build an audience which I suppose he's taken in a right-wing direction, again, following on the lead from American politics, really. And it is Rupert Murdoch who is going to be creating the second right-wing competitor to the BBC. This is not going to have a Freeview channel, but apparently be available online for a streaming service. It's been compared to Netflix on the Murdoch outfit. The Mail report. David Rhodes, a former executive for Murdoch's US-based Fox News, is running the News UK project from its London base under the auspices of Chief Executive Rebecca Brooks. Sources close to the project are at pains to deny that it is intended to be a British version of the right-wing Fox News, instead likening it to a TV version of Talk Radio, Talk Sport and Times Radio, all of which are already part of the News UK stable. Now, fine, they can protest that, they can say it's not like Fox News, but there's a problem with that statement, which is the TV version of Talk Radio is Fox News, right? They like to pretend that Talk Radio is not like that uncouth Fox News over in the United States. No, if you watch Talk Radio, they're big on YouTube now. They've sort of transferred already from audio to visual. You will find right-wing Mike Graham having a sort of weekly 15-minute conversation with Nigel Farage, where you have someone who's incredibly right-wing discussing migration with someone who's incredibly right-wing, and they're both reinforcing this narrative that we're under threat from a few vulnerable people coming to these shores in dinghies. This action that they're promoting, this idea that people are unjustly being put up in hotels, has encouraged, yes, far-right activists to go around hotels, knocking on doors and asking probably terrified asylum seekers, why they're there, where have they come from? So the idea that a TV version of Talk Radio is something more innocent, more civilized than Fox News is for the birds. Aaron, how worried should we be? As much as we criticize the BBC, I think we probably both agree that having an institution which does have a mandate to be impartial is better than the kind of system you have in the United States, where you have various competing billionaire-owned networks who have, you can't hold them to account. You can't even say you're not being impartial because they were never meant to be impartial. Are we about to see in this country the same kind of power in the hands of billionaire network owners?
I have a question for you in that question you've asked for me. When was the BBC ever held accountable for its political output? Robbie Gibb is involved in one of these undertakings. He was literally one of the most senior people in terms of the BBC Westminster operation. There were a plethora of mistakes made in the last general election, huge mistakes, not interviewing the incumbent Prime Minister, yet grilling the leader of the opposition. Multiple videos which edited out what seemed to be gaffes by the Prime Minister. The political editor of the BBC, Laura Kuenssberg, divulging information which was, arguably it was illegal what she did, let alone, journalistically unprofessional. Where was there accountability? People say, we prefer the BBC to, what they have in the States because we have accountability. Do we? It's a really important question. How? How do we have accountability? What are the mechanisms? I would say in the abstract, I agree with you. But I would say, in terms of the lived reality of the Labour Party from 2015 to 2019, what did for Jeremy Corbyn, what did for the left, wasn't the right-wing media, wasn't the tabloids, wasn't Sky News, it was the BBC and it was The Guardian, particularly the BBC, I think. That's my personal view. Now, does that mean I want to get rid of the BBC? No, not at all. But I do think in 2017, and we don't talk about this nearly enough, there was a confluence of incredibly advantageous circumstances when it came to the media. You had the decline, this propitious, decades-long decline of right-wing tabloids. They were hitting their bottom, but you hadn't yet had the rise of a kind of people like Talk Radio RBC having the kind of energy they had in 2019 to undermine Jeremy Corbyn. So the legacy media of the right was weakening. They hadn't yet formulated a solution. At the same time, the Facebook algorithm meant outlets like Evolve and The Canary all of a sudden were getting shared, and The Independent should be added, were getting shared more broadly than any of the right-wing tabloids. Now, people like Rupert Murdoch look at that in 2017 and they said that can never, ever happen again. So they're looking at how do you revivify the tabloid format, the tabloid formula for the 21st century. And they recognise Talk Radio, they recognise LBC as potentially the Sun, the Daily Mirror of the 2020s. And I think that's probably correct. It's incredibly cheap. It's incredibly disposable. It doesn't lend itself to good journalism. It doesn't, but when did the Sun do that? And so I think it makes total sense for Rupert Murdoch, from a political perspective, to do precisely this. Look, the Sun's been losing money head over arse for a very long time. Rupert Murdoch doesn't own the Sun to make money. Rupert Murdoch owns the Sun in order to influence political outcomes. And I think that's precisely what's driving these efforts. It's not about creating, important media, holding politicians to account, fostering a healthy debate in this country. It's about influencing political outcomes, as you've so expertly outlined, on the behalf of the billionaire class. No break there. So how do we respond? I think ultimately the left has to be realistic here. We have a Conservative government. We have a BBC which has been politically muzzled by the right to a lesser or greater extent for 40 years. Tom Mills, in his excellent book, Myth of a Public Service, talks about this. So even if we think the BBC in some idealised form would be great, that's not what's happening. It's being stripped back. It's subject to unbelievable cuts. What does that mean? It means they have to take the lead in terms of the broader news agenda from tabloid print media, even though that's dying on its backside, right? We need to formulate a solution which goes beyond defend the BBC. Completely inadequate. What does that look like? It means building new media. And of course, you should go to support.novaramedia.com or novaramedia.com/support to help us build a new media for different politics. But, tonight, Grace Blakely is going on the BBC as Tribune. And I think that's great. We're going to need outlets that can compete and advance perspectives and politics from a left-wing kind of point of view in a way that hasn't happened for 30, 40 years. The incumbent legacy liberal opinion, or emerges from the popular mass, the working people of this country, I don't think that's necessarily correct.
No, I think that point's correct. And I mean, I feel what Russell Howard did there was, he delivered it with a bit of wit, which is kind of what you can get taught at private school.
But didn't you think
it doesn't challenge anything? It's not anti-establishment. I mean, the context, it's boring.
Wasn't it just predictable? It was predictable.
It was predictable and it was boring.
I mean, you could get in 5 years, you could
deliver it in a fine way.
In 5 years, you could get an algorithm to write that script.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you could have written it just by, looking at the leader column of the Times and then making it into joke form. I think I wish we had a clip of it actually, because someone who, compare the comedy of someone like Mark Thomas to that from Russell Howard. I was watching this on YouTube yesterday, and he stands up and makes a joke. He says, politicians are so corrupt in this country that tabloids can just make up sentences. So there's a hamster who, a Tory cabinet minister put a hamster up his butt wearing a Nazi uniform whilst licking cocaine off a grandma's arse crack. And a Tory MP will just put their hand up and say, yep, that was me. That's the kind of thing. I mean, you have to, I'm not a comedian. You have to watch it to get it. But it's this kind of stuff that's really, you listen to it, you're like, oh my God, did he just say that on national television about people in authority in this country? No one pulls that off at the moment. I suppose it's because they've been, pushed off the airwaves.
Things are so bad that somebody like Aisha Hazarika can say with a straight face that she's a comedian. That's how bad things are.
We're going to move on to our next and final story of the evening. Will political violence save Trump's election campaign? It's a big question. which will have some very big ramifications, of course. We don't need to tell you that. Trump's disastrous handling of the coronavirus has positioned Joe Biden to be the strong favourite to win November's presidential election, despite his many flaws. But with his polling lagging, Trump seems committed to stoking political violence and racial tension as a strategy to defeat his Democratic opponent. Two events have put political violence back at the top of the agenda in the United States. So the first is after police shot and critically wounded a black father, Jacob Blake. Black Lives Matter protests have erupted in Kenosha, a city in the swing state of Wisconsin. Now, in the midst of those protests, a Trump supporter, a right-winger, 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, shot 3 BLM protesters, killing 2. So Rittenhouse has been charged with murder. It was a politically motivated act. And you might expect the president in this situation, a supporter of his, has murdered 2 people in cold blood, to sort of ask for calm, potentially distance himself from those actions. That's not what happened. Let's take a look at this phenomenal video.
Accused of killing 2 people.
As a supporter of yours, saying, are you going to condemn the actions of vigilantes like Kyle Rittenhouse?
We're looking at all of it. That was an interesting situation. You saw the same tape as I saw, and he was trying to get away from them, I guess, it looks like, and he fell, and then they very violently attacked him, and it was something that we're looking at right now, and it's under investigation, but I guess he was in very big trouble. He would have been. He probably would have been killed. But it's under investigation.
Do you think private citizens should be taking guns?
I'd like to see law enforcement take care of everything. I think everything should be taken care of, law enforcement. But again, we have to give our cops back, our police back, their dignity, the respect. They're very talented people.
Now, one, you might think it's completely batshit for a US president to be standing up there and ultimately defending someone who has shot 2 people at a protest. The opposite of calling for calm. But more shocking than that, more worrying actually, is that if you were to hear that without knowing the context, you might think that, yes, this person, maybe he shouldn't have killed the protesters, but they were attacking him. He says, literally, he would have been killed if he hadn't shot people. Now, what he doesn't tell you is that man, the shooter, was only accosted by protesters after he'd shot someone dead. So this idea that he'd shot people in self-defense. No, he was accosted by protesters after he'd shot someone in cold blood. And Donald Trump is standing up there saying, this is a good thing, this is justifiable.
Also, he crossed state lines to do it. If you say, look, he was outside his house and he did this, okay, there's something there. But the guy crossed state lines, armed, shot a protester, and yes, then there was a response. Are you surprised? I'm not.
I mean, it's completely outrageous. Well, obviously, it's ridiculous to say it's outrageous because it's appalling, it's gross, it's dangerous, right?
But it's surprising still that he would do this.
Yeah, I mean, to go to that extent. But also, I mean, the question is this a sensible strategy on his behalf? So what proportion of the American public are going to look at this and say this is absolutely appalling and also this is a complete lie, which he is standing up there and telling us? Or to what extent are people going to think, oh yeah, maybe it was in self-defense. Maybe the problem is the BLM Antifa. Unfortunately, there was also a far-right protester who was shot on the weekend. I think we still don't know exactly who did it. But obviously, there is the spectre of political violence in the United States right now, and Donald Trump seems to be licking his lips. Obviously, we should point out that political murders happen from the right. This one on the weekend, potentially, we don't know who shot the guy, if it was a left-winger, and whoever it was. Political violence in the United States right now, don't do it. It's a slippery slope. It's not going to work. It's not going to achieve your ends unless you're a crazy right-winger. I want to go to another clip from Donald Trump, which is kind of just as bizarre, just as impossibly ridiculous as the last one. This is him going on about a bizarre conspiracy theory about protesters being transported on aeroplanes. Let's take a look.
More about this plot that you were referring to on Fox News last night.
Which?
This plot of people gathering on a plane in here.
Yeah, I could tell you that I could probably refer you to the person and they could do it. I'd like to ask that person if it was okay, but a person was on a plane, said that there were about 6 people like that person, more or less. And what happened is the entire plane filled up with the looters, the anarchists, the rioters, people that obviously were looking for trouble. And the person felt very uncomfortable in the plane. This would be a person you know, so I will see whether or not I can get that person. I'll let them know, and I'll see whether or not I can get that person to speak to you. But this was a first-hand account of a plane going from Washington to wherever, and I'll see if I can get that information for you. Maybe they'll speak to you, maybe they won't.
So that interview was a follow-up. He was being asked to elaborate on the accusation or the claim he'd made on Fox News the previous day, that Black Bloc or Antifa were sort of being flown around. So, it sounds like kind of on charter planes. He's saying that there were 6 normal people on the plane. Everyone else was wearing masks and they were ready to take part in some kind of riot. The accusations very vague, very bizarre, but some people might believe it. I mean, Aaron, I know you've been doing a clip today, a film, a Novara Media film about conspiracy theories, about QAnon.
Yeah.
What's the background here? Who is he speaking to when he talks about an aeroplane which, apart from 6 seats, is packed full of Antifa, traveling across the country to join riots wherever they seem like they could break out?
Well, there's a complex analysis to be had here, but he's effectively creating alternative facts. And when I say alternative facts, it's not an alternative account of what we're already talking about. He's creating whole new sets of facts to not talk about anything that resembles reality. Another example of this is he's been talking about how rioters are so smart they've taken to throwing tins of soup at the police. And of course, when the police go to stop them, they say, "I'm just carrying tins of soup for my family." And then the police can't arrest them. Again,